Elena pressed the photo of her triplets against her apron pocket. She was just an invisible waitress in a high-end restaurant, but tonight she saw what no one was supposed to see: a gun pointed at the most dangerous man in the city. She had two choices: stay silent and stay poor, or save the Mafia Boss and change her children's destiny forever. There were 3 bowls on the counter, each rimmed with the faint smear of a spoon. The youngest one had jam on his chin. The middle one's curls stuck damp against his forehead. Elena moved between them with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to stretch a minute into many. She hummed something half-recognizable, the melody of a childhood lullaby she could not afford to forget. Morning light came thin through a single kitchen window, catching on an old brass keyring pinned to a nail beside the door. 2 keys and a tiny metal charm shaped like a heart, its surface worn smooth. She counted the breaths of the babies as if they were her only measure of time. Outside, the city was waking, the distant slap of a newspaper against a stoop, a subway train sighing underground, a saxophone fuzzing into life from the corner where someone sold coffee and used records. Elena wiped a bowl with a rag, folded the napkins into neat squares, and lined up 3 little shoes by the door. She checked the timetable pinned beneath the calendar: night class at 7, the restaurant at 10. There would be a quick nap, a swarm of tasks, a double shift, and a calculus problem folded into the middle of her schedule like a secret. Her life was a ledger of small, necessary calculations: how long to heat formula, how many hours behind the line, how many stops between the diner and the cheap room they could still call home. She kissed the babies one by one, a ritual that steadied her hands. In the mirror by the sink, she straightened her apron, smoothed the hair that refused to obey any of her plans. In the pocket of that apron there was always a Polaroid, 3 tiny faces cropped into a single frame. The photo had been taken in a community garden on a spring day, dirty toes and syrup on the youngest's lip. An honest picture that made Elena both breathless and steady when she looked at it. She pressed the photograph flat with her thumb, memorized the soft angles of their mouths. The children were everything that made compromise necessary and right. She would not let anything happen to them. By 8 she had handed the triplets to Marta, who lived below and treated them like grandchildren of her own. Marta's apartment smelled like lemon oil and old wood. She brewed coffee with the precision of someone who had been keeping watch for decades. "I'll call you if anything," Marta said, fussing with a chipped cup. Her voice was the sound of a hand on a shoulder. Elena left with a kiss and a list of things to bring home, each line written like a promise. The restaurant at night was a different world. Chrome catching the lights, the scent of onions caramelizing, jazz sax slurring into the far corner, where Louis, the bartender, kept a playlist that changed with the weather. Rosa, the manager, ran the floor with short, efficient instructions that left no room for indulgence. "Tonight's rush is family style. Keep the tickets tight," she told Elena. Elena moved behind the counter with the focus of someone who had practiced survival like a skill. Orders became a rhythm: soups ladled, burgers flipped, coffee poured in clean arcs. The spoon tapping the saucer was a small, steady metronome to her life. At the corner table, a large man sat with the composure of a person who expected to be noticed and not questioned. His jacket was too good for the neighborhood. The way he folded his hands on the table was more ritual than casual. He had a ledger with him, a plain notebook, and a glass of water that he never quite finished. The man spoke rarely, his mouth a narrow line when he did. Elena had had that feeling before, that some people carried a gravity that made the air around them change. She noticed him the way she noticed the bus that didn't come on time, an anomaly with consequences. Behind him, a customer fumbled with a pistol in his coat, checking it with a nervous familiarity, unlike the man in the jacket, who remained calmly composed. Elena's first instinct was to move, to make obstacles, refill a glass, clatter a plate in the sink, anything to make the moment procedural again, to keep the pattern of the restaurant from breaking into danger. Instead, she found herself pausing at the check stand, the bill in front of the ledger man. Her hand hovered with a pen. She saw the nervous man's eyes skitter, the other patrons' unaware faces, the jazz sax leaning into the night like a witness that could not speak. She wrote on the bill, small and neat, not a warning shouted, nor a plea. A line of ink that said simply, "Watch your back." Then she slid it across the table and kept washing. It was what she had always done: keep the pattern, protect where she could, and fold her interventions into the everyday until they were no longer obvious. The ledger man looked at the note without surprise. He folded it and kept it for a long minute, as if the handwriting belonged to a script he had read before. When he left that night, he left with the deliberate slowness of someone who marks his exits. Elena did not know his name. She had a glance, a ledger, and the ink on a bill. That would have been the end of it. Another small private interaction folded into a long evening, if not for the way the city resolves things that do not stay small. The next morning, before dawn, there were police cars with their lights muted, a cluster of officers outside the restaurant, questions that smelled of adrenaline and rubber. The nervous man had been stopped 2 blocks away with a weapon he ought not to have had, and a minor scene had been made public. Inspector Hale, tall and authoritative, asked Elena questions that felt like cold hands. What she had seen, when, and whether she had written the note. She answered plainly because she had nothing to gain by embellishment. Hale's eyes were not unkind. He asked after the children, and she spoke about Marta and the Polaroid and the small chest of baby clothes. That should have been the end of it. It was not. The ledger man returned one evening, not with the ledger, but with a suite of implications. He slid into the same corner seat as before, and when Elena brought his coffee, he spoke once, quietly, so that only she would hear. "You warned me," he said. The words had no accusation in them, only the observation of someone who catalogued behaviors like items in a ledger. "You look after things. You notice." Elena kept her voice even. "I look after customers." He smiled then, an aperture of civility. "You look after more than that. You have 3 in the photo you carry." She felt the Polaroid in her pocket, the paper warm from the laundry she had shoved it into. Her throat closed. She had been careful. She carried the image like a talisman, never letting the children be visible in public without the buffer of someone else watching. She did not like to bring them to the restaurant. The ledger man did not seem surprised that she kept the image. He reached forward and tapped the corner of the photograph she had borrowed, to cut a list into her memory. "I can keep them safe," he said. The sentence was not a promise and not a threat. It was a transaction stated in a voice that understood the language of necessity. Elena thought first of how that sounded. Offer. She thought second of the ledger man's presence, the way the restaurant's ritual seemed to arrange itself around him. She thought of the nights she lay awake trying to calculate rent in fractions, and of the feeling that she'd been keeping the wrong kind of faith. "What do you mean?" she asked. He named what he could provide. Protection, a cord of people who answered to him, a watch that could be placed between her family and risk. In return, he wanted a favor. Not violent favors, he said. Not anything that would require her to break her hands. He wanted information, small observations, snippets that only someone on the floor could see. Who came with whom? Who was jittery? Who kept late hours? The kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with the way a city moved. It was a proposition nested in a promise that included his own authority. When he said, "You will be a receiver," he used a word that fit her pattern of life, someone who knew how to listen and to mark what mattered. He said nothing about names, nothing about blood, only about the cost of safety. Elena felt the Polaroid's edge against her thigh. She imagined those 3 little faces, one leaning into the other like a small human fortress. The calculus in her head was immediate and stifling. The hours she could gain if something guaranteed safety, the nights she could sleep without imagining the worst. But with the offer came a new kind of ledger, one not printed on paper but on people's lives, on obligations that bound like stitches. She asked for something in return before she agreed. It was a small thing in words and a large thing in reality, written protection. A signature that said he would stand between her and harm. He laughed softly at first, as if the formality was quaint, then produced a small pad of paper and a pen. The paper was plain and heavy. The pen was solid, its metal worn in places where fingers had gripped it before. "You trust ink more than I do?" he asked. "No," she said. "I trust something I can point to." They made their way into the restaurant's back office, a cramped room with lemon oil on the counter and a ledger of its own, receipts pinned with thumbtacks, a calendar with dates circled. Marco, she learned his name then, wrote the sentence in careful strokes, a promise of protection for her and her children. The pen's nib scraped, and Elena watched the ink spread into permanence. Somewhere in the building a spoon clicked against a saucer, the domestic rhythm continuing as if the world could be held together by small actions. She signed because she thought it would save 3 bowls from being empty and 3 shoes from being lined up and never worn. When her signature met the paper, it felt like sealing a small cage, a protection that required confinement. It felt, at the moment, like a necessary confinement. After that, the texture of her days changed. There were small courtesies, a driver who hovered at a distance on longer shifts, a man who sat outside the apartment building for brief stretches. They said little, watched much, and removed themselves whenever Elena nodded. The driver's face, bland with training, became part of the room in her life. It was reassuring in a way that also made her chest tighten. The knowledge that someone had taken on the burden of watching left her more vulnerable in other ways. A week after she had signed, the driver did not show up for her midnight shift. Marta noticed a man who lingered in the stairwell and got nervous. Elena felt the old ledger of instincts kick in. Always watch, always check. She sped home during a smoke break to find 3 pairs of shoes still by the door. The apartment as she had left it, but with a sense of a room that had been read by other eyes. There was no damage, only the fraying revelation that someone had been close enough to touch the threshold. On a night that smelled of rain and engine oil, Elena reached the restaurant and found a slip of paper beneath the cash register. A receipt for a loading dock 2 neighborhoods over, with a time marked. It was the kind of detail that could have meant anything. An order, a delivery, a misfiled account. She tucked it into her apron and kept working while the saxophone in the corner switched to something with more worry in its notes. She did the job she had been trained to do in life: notice, catalog, and act. The receipt would sit against her ribcage like a compass, angling her toward something she could not yet name. When she cleaned the prep area between courses, she found a USB shoved into the corner of a crate, as if someone had hidden it there and forgotten breakfast. The drive was small and unmarked, a black capsule that looked like a throat of anonymous data. Elena took it home because there was nowhere else to turn. She did not know the language of data, but she knew the hunger of people for protection and for reason. She could not hand it to Marco, at least not without knowing what it meant. She could not leave it out where someone could use it as a route into her apartment. She thought of Inspector Hale's measured face amid police lights and decided to bring it to him. Thomas came into the picture like a practiced hand. He was a friend, handyman by trade, someone who could fix a leaky sink and not ask questions about his own moral ledger. He had always been kind to the children and had a history of acts that did not require receipts. "If you're going to do this," he said, the day Elena showed him the USB in the dim light of Marta's kitchen, "do it right. Don't touch anything unnecessary." They did not. They were careful. Thomas drove them to a neutral meeting place where Inspector Hale could receive the drive without theater. Hale took it with the professionalism of a man who had been offered stranger things before: dirty money, desperate confessions, anonymous evidence. He was grateful but circumspect. "Chain of custody matters," he told Elena and Thomas. "We can't build a case on rumors. We can build it on what we can corroborate. We'll send it to forensics. Claire will take it from there." Claire was methodical in a way that felt almost like tenderness. In the lab, she swabbed the drive with gloves, took notes that were precise, and measured time like a resource. "We can build a paper trail," she said. "We can analyze metadata, timestamps, but we need corroborating observations. We need witnesses who won't get lost in the fog." Her voice was not unkind. Elena recognized the sentence as a professional fact with moral implications. Justice moved because people agreed to testify, because people were willing to risk. Claire tucked the USB into a secure case and closed a lid that sounded final, yet not absolute. What followed was procedure that stretched like a taut wire. Interviews, small surveillance, the assembling of pattern and proof. It was not cinematic in the way movies promised. There were no explosions, no dramatic confessions. There were phone calls that took hours to return, and transcripts that arrived in handwritten packets. Inspector Hale worked with the patient movement of someone who had learned to win grudges, not with force, but with persistence. They traced transactions, corroborated receipts, and matched times. Elena sat in meetings and recited what she had seen. Who lingered, who left at odd hours, the details she had from behind a counter. All the while, Marco's world did not collapse. It shifted and rearranged like buildings after an earthquake, some facades gone, others leaning into new alignments. Arrests were surgical and limited. Javier, Marco's lieutenant, picked up on a minor charge, a courier on the fringes. People in Marco's orbit felt the balance change and adjusted. The authorities secured some of the circuits. The core remained. At the same time, Elena felt the weight of a life rearranged by small concessions. The driver still met her sometimes, but now he watched in a way that made Elena think of invisible chains. She had accepted written protection, and now accepted the cost of being someone's receiver. She was not forced into violence. That was not the bargain. But she was slowly mapped into a network of obligations. There were men who asked for favors with the politeness of people who know they are owed. There were nights she would come home and count the keys on the ring and measure the distance between them by how much they altered her away time. The moral cost was not a single moment, but 1,000 small renditions. Her agency was always present. She chose to hand over the USB. She chose to sign the paper. She chose to speak to Inspector Hale. But with each choice came new bindings. The city taught you to keep ledgers either way. Elena had learned to write her own. The climax happened not with a gunshot, but with a choice that required her to step into the open. Claire called after a week of quiet. "We got something," she said, with a voice that made Elena listen as if the lab had magnified the world. "There are transfers, logs that link a set of accounts to operations that should not be connected. It's enough to get a warrant." Hale organized a small team, precise, careful, prepared to move without fanfare. Elena sat in her car and counted breaths like she counted forks at the diner, a habit of ordering chaos. She had made the decision to go to the warehouse with Thomas, to be the one who would point. She would be a witness whose presence could allow officers to move. She was not there to fight. She was there to show up in a way that meant something. Their approach was ordinary. A loading dock 2 neighborhoods over, a place where men came with packages and left with heavier pockets. The distraction that had to be made was small, a delivery truck with a faulty brake that delayed a routine, a swing of the dock door that allowed officers to move in. Thomas was the one who caused the noise, a honk and a misaligned pallet that required attention. It was all mundane, precisely because these kinds of operations usually pretended to be part of the city's daily grind. Elena moved through the warehouse like someone walking through a room she half-owned. The crates smelled of wood and dust. She slid between rows and watched faces that now recognized her as more than a waitress. She found the bin where Javier organized invoices, and there, tucked in a paperwork sleeve, a small plastic capsule, another USB, labeled with an innocuous name that did not match what it contained. She flicked the drive into the pocket of her coat, feeling the weight like a heartbeat. She felt suddenly the intimacy of all these things, the way a city holds secrets in pockets and under counters, the way a life can be kept together by holding small things tightly. The officers moved in with a quiet competence and took statements. Elena's presence was a lining of facts that helped them interpret the data Claire had already read. They made arrests at the margins, drivers, couriers, people whose lives had been arranged by others, but who could still be made to satisfy the law. After the raids, there was a slow kind of triumph, not joyous, but effective. Claire called to confirm that the drives matched patterns in the financial trace, invoices, transfers, accounts masked as legitimate businesses. The chain of custody had been maintained. The drive had been collected, cataloged, processed. That was everything in a legal world that moves like molasses. Inspector Hale thanked Elena with a look that acknowledged the tension of gratitude, a recognition that she had made the choice and paid for the consequences. Marco's response was not immediate and not violent. He rearranged. He sent messages through people with soft edges. Javier's arrest had been a blow, but not a collapse. The network adapted. The city ate small defeats with a disinterest that felt like a measure of everything that kept hope from collapsing into fantasy. Marco remained a presence in the periphery, a man who could not be completely erased by indictments that reached for the surface. Elena's life after the investigation was no denouement in a film. It was a set of routines updated to keep the family whole. They moved, first, a temporary tenancy in a safer building offered by a state program and a referral from Inspector Hale. The apartment was smaller and quieter, but it had a door that closed with a satisfying click. Elena kept the pen she had used to sign the protection paper, now a heavy object on her kitchen counter. It had become a talisman and a reminder of compromise. Sometimes she rolled it between her fingers and imagined it as a compass that had pointed toward a necessary survival. She continued her nights at the restaurant. She went back to class because she was determined, stubborn in a way that was not noble but practical. Education had cost and reward in the same currency. Thomas fixed the leaky sink in the kitchen and kept his hands steady. Marta watched the children and came to every recital for reasons that had nothing to do with formal obligation. She was a small ring of warmth in the margins of Elena's new map of life. Louis, the bartender, continued to pick records with a self-conscious tenderness. Rosa handled the floor with fewer surprises. There were adjustments, code words, minor routines that felt like rituals. Elena held a tiny keyring with 2 keys and the heart charm every night before sleep. She used routes that were different from before, longer ways that avoided certain blocks, smiles to neighbors that meant nothing and everything. Her days were cataloged with the kind of detail that made survival possible. Reading receipts, noting faces, practicing roots. These were the armor of a life she had chosen to rearrange for her family. The justice they achieved was partial. Some arrests were made, the couriers and the men on the edge. There were charges, hearings, and delays that tasted like bureaucratic tea. Marco's name surfaced sometimes in paperwork, sometimes in the legal obituaries of men who had been called into question and freed. The system had purchased a few breaks, but had not dismantled the entire machine that had once offered to keep her safe in exchange for small reports. That was the reality they lived in. Imperfect, slow, but less indifferent than before. There were nights that Elena lay awake wondering if some other bargain would be required, whether the city's ledger would demand more. There were days when a car slowed twice too long at the corner, and Elena counted breaths until the shadow passed. There were mornings when the 3 bowls were full, and the children laughed, and Elena thought that perhaps all of this had been worth it. At the same time, she had a new sense of authority in herself. The signature on the paper had been a choice she made, not an imposition. She had placed herself at the intersection of the legal and the illicit, and found there was dignity in choosing the smallest possible harm to avert a larger one. She learned to carry the burden. Some burdens you choose to shoulder, because they are the only alternatives that keep the people you love from being torn apart. The final scene was small and exact. Elena standing under a streetlight that threw a narrow cone of yellow across the pavement. She held her keyring between 2 fingers, counting the metal as if it were currency. The charm caught the light and sent a shallow spark across the asphalt. Close by, the triplets slept in a room lined with second-hand books and a mobile that turned slowly above their beds. They breathed, and each breath was its own argument against despair. Inspector Hale stopped by once at the door with an update and a tattered smile. "We found an opening," he said. "We've got a pattern enough to keep them off some streets for a while." It was not the promise of retribution, only of a cautious clearing of space. Elena accepted it with a nod that included gratitude and a new form of resolve. To raise her children in a way that taught them the difference between survival and surrender. She kept the receipt that had started the whole unraveling in a drawer, a small crumpled thing marked with a loading dock and a time. She kept the pen and she kept the Polaroid. She had learned that objects carry the weight of decisions, that they can act as anchors in a life prone to drift. Sometimes, at the end of a long shift, she would stand at the sink and rinse the bowls, the same rhythm she had started the story with. The spoon would tap the rim like a heartbeat that could be read if you knew how. She would look at the worn keyring and choose, again and again, what burdens she would shoulder and which to leave behind. It was not heroic in any mythic sense. It was a ledger of necessary choices. There was ambiguity in the world now, not only as a fact, but as a moral horizon. She could not make things perfect, and she did not pretend otherwise. She had made a trade that saved small things. 3 bowls filled, 3 shoes that were worn as they should be, 3 little mouths that laughed in the morning. She had also bound herself to a watchful presence that would not simply disappear. Marco remained a man with a ledger and an eye for patterns. He had altered the shape of her life by seeing what she loved and offering to preserve it at a cost. The last image held to the end was of Elena under that same streetlight, keyring in hand, counting the ways she could move. She thought of all the choices that had laid a path for her family. The night she wrote a note on a bill, the ink that sealed the paper, the moment she handed the USB into evidence. She thought of Thomas and Marta, and the patient competence of Claire, and the steady presence of Inspector Hale. She thought of the children, small and luminous in their sleep. She said to herself softly, not a prayer but a promise, "I won't look away. Not when there are 3 mouths at my table. I will choose what to carry." If you were her, would you tell someone? Comment, "I would have stayed silent," or "I would have told plus 1 sentence why." Months passed with the ordinary geometry of life. Elena took her classes and learned to sleep better in shorter stretches. Her nights at the restaurant became less tense, more routine, and her routines were the armor she had built. Occasionally, a man with an indifferent smile would pass through and nod. Sometimes Marco's name surfaced in reports, and sometimes in the city's rumor channels. The balance remained complicated. The protection had bought time and safety, and had also rewritten the terms on which Elena lived. The children grew in the subtle ways of small people, an extra tooth here, a new favorite vegetable there. Elena read them stories and folded laundry and reprimanded with the tiredness that meant she loved more than she wanted to admit. She taught them small rules. Look both ways. Don't take candy from strangers. Always tell somebody where you're going. The list of rules she gave them included one she said to herself as often as to them. There are bargains in life, and you will choose only the ones that keep you whole. Inspector Hale visited on quiet days with updates. A plea bargain, a pending hearing, a call from Claire with some new line of data that suggested other patterns. Each piece was another small victory, and another reminder that justice was procedural and slow. Elena learned to read that slow as a kind of grace. What remained, in the end, was not a neat victory. Marco's presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of a photograph. He had seen the triplets, and for a time he had offered to hold them safe inside his sphere of influence. She had accepted, but she had never been owned. That was the distinction that made her both culpable and free. She had chosen to take on the burden. On a late autumn evening, the three little shoes were lined up in a row by the door as they always were. Elena tucked the photograph into a book, the edge of it sticking out like a secret marker. She picked up the keyring and felt the weight of the two keys and the tiny heart charm that had become more than jewelry. It was a small constellation of meaning. She locked the door, clicked the keys, and held the ring between her fingers. Under the streetlight, the charm caught and sent a thin flare like a small promise. Her life had been rearranged by visibility. The ledger man, Marco, had seen what she loved and had offered insurance. In doing so, he had made her a participant in a world she had never wished to know, and had also given her leverage she could use to protect the people who mattered most. Elena breathed once, slow and decisive, and stepped into the night, counting routes and possibilities. She understood the trade-offs now, in a way she had only guessed before. That survival sometimes asks you to change the shape of your pride, that protection might require accepting uncertainty, and that love often asks you to weigh burdens so they are distributed differently. She kept the pen on the counter, the receipt in the drawer, and the Polaroid tucked in the book. She kept the keyring. She kept them because objects were easier to grasp than the abstractions of right and wrong. They were anchors. She had not become someone else. She had become someone who would not look away, who would sign when necessary, who would hand evidence into the proper hands, who would take a driver when it meant the difference between sleep and the absence of it. She would pass on to her children a life not unmarred but defended in practical ways. She would teach them how to count the smallest things, how to notice the saxophone in the corner, how to place a spoon on the rim, and listen. At the very end, she stood under the streetlight and closed her hand around the cold metal of the charm. There was no triumphant finale, no tidy justice. There was a small, stubborn clarity that she could not afford to look away, and so she chose what she would carry. She breathed in the city air, tasted rain and lemon oil and the fading notes of a saxophone, and walked home. Share this story with someone who appreciates careful dramas and the difficult choices people make to protect the ones they love.